Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me here. As you know, I am sorry, I need to change this screen. Um, yeah, my name is Nazi. I am the CEO of an organization called New Citizens Gateway, formerly known as Barnet Refugee Service. And we have been dealing with refugees and asylum seekers since 2005 as an independent charity. And I've been involved with the organization before being an independent charity since year 2000. I'm a psychotherapist, so my focus is on mental health of refugees and asylum seekers. What I'm going to be sharing with you today is about refugees and asylum seekers. I'm sure my colleagues all day talked about mental health issues, what happens to them. I don't want to bore you. I'm sure we all know what they go through, the dangerous and stressful flights, problems when they come here. Habib and Sayed clearly talked about it, and experience of loss, so many things. So I'm not going to go through that. What I really want to share with you today is how us as an organization try to focus on mental health of refugees and asylum seekers, but in a different way. Main reason is that we have, through working with refugees and asylum seekers, majority of them having mental health issues, depression, anxiety, post-trauma, and we all know about that. And what we noticed through supporting these groups, we noticed that apart from their mental health issues, they've got lots of practical issues that really, really contributes to how they feel. Habib clearly said that, his practical issues really, pushed him to think about suicide. So he wasn't suicidal when he got here, but obviously his practical issues really was too much to cope. And this is exactly what we experienced through working with this client group. Financial difficulties, poverty, loss of identity was another thing that we always faced when we were supporting this client group. Lack of employment, they used to be somebody in their own country, but they felt that they can't maintain their family, they can't. So that really contributed to their mental health issues, apart from the experiences they went through, poor accommodation and cultural barriers. So if we look at the, I trained here. I'm originally from Iran myself, but I got trained here as a therapist in England. So what I was very, what was really interesting for me was that obviously these assumptions underlying clinical practice, which is mainly developed for wealthy countries and for Western culture. So we were taught that to treat, like people with mental health issues based on theories. And that's how I was trained. But when I went to the community, when I started working, particularly with refugees and asylum seekers, I realized that it is very difficult. It is, how can I, work with a client using this particular theory, whereas I know they've got lots of issues. They come with letters from the Home Office. So I noticed that us as therapists, we are spending lots of time solving their problems rather than helping them with their mental health issues. So again, another thing, apart from being this, like the framework being really focused on Western people, and we were trying to use that and localize it, if you like, was the perception of mental health within our client group. I remember I was referred a young boy who was schizophrenic, and the parents, they were referred to us as an organization because the parents were refusing treatment, and believed that he was possessed. So you can imagine that how difficult it is for mental health support worker to support somebody who doesn't even believe what the mental health issue is. And I'm sure you all know that, you know, different countries look at mental health differently. So this was another issue. One other thing, again, I tell you about my personal experience that, you know, as a CEO of the organization, I've been involved sitting on different boards and talking, and, you know, like when they were, I mean, like the local CCG, for example, they were trying to draw their policies. And I noticed that one thing that they don't realize is sometimes having, you know, this much funding to do counseling is not necessarily doesn't work with this particular client group, because counseling, they don't attend. They always say that they don't attend. But on the other hand, we can see that where bilingual counseling in mother tongue is provided, people are more interested, people are more engaged, and they are more willing to get support. So culture is a very, very important element. I mean, my personal story is when I was training as a therapist, we had to have our own counseling, personal therapy, and I had an English counselor. My English is not too bad. I've been in this country for such a long time. I feel I'm integrated, and we were okay. And then she immigrated, and I had to change my therapist. This time I found an Iranian therapist who could speak Farsi. And with the first session, I thought, oh my God, it's such a comfortable position I'm in. So personally, I felt that this mother tongue it plays a lot in terms of mental health support. And what I did my doctorate on mental well-being of refugees and asylum seekers. And basically my question was why counseling is not successful, if you like, within the, you know, like using the typical, you know, framework. And then I looked at the understanding mental health in relation to culture from Suman Fernando's point of view, which clearly says Western against non-Western. And obviously you can see the way he looks at the mental health is completely different. So that was an area I did lots of research on. And I came up with this idea that why don't we provide a package? What if when we say mental health support, we don't provide just one-to-one counseling? Why don't we provide a package that we can help them with their practical issues? At the same time, we provide psychosocial activities and try to promote social cohesion, and also try to support them to run a normal life, if you like. And this is the definition of it by Red Cross, which says it's a process of facilitating resilience within individuals, families, and communities. What I did, I based my doctorate on, or developed it based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I remember when I mentioned this to my supervisor, he said to me, Maslow, come on, it's very old and cliche. And I said, I agree with you. It could be cliche, but within cliches, you can be creative. And at the same time, you have to look at us as, you know, like people from ethnic minorities and the way the mental health is viewed. And when it comes to refugees and asylum seekers, the problems they go through before getting here, the problems they face when they come here. So I was trying to say that we need more than just one-to-one counseling for these people. And that's how I developed this holistic model of support based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And obviously, from a clinical point of view, the services were on Suman Fernando's Western and non-Western theory. The most common issues presented by clients after settlement, this is after settlement, during the, you know, my research, was the role of culture was the first one. the impact of language loss. It was amazing that how the language, the effect of language impacted their mental health, the inability to be able to express themselves, or but being relying on their children or other people. And the biggest one was the loss of identity and sense of belonging, which they all felt that, we feel that we are nobody here. A doctor from Afghanistan, in here, he's working in a pizza shop, and he feels that he has lost his identity. He doesn't know himself anymore. And that sense of belonging, which is very interesting. I share this with you as a person who's been in this country 35 years. Once somebody asked me, you are well integrated, you've got a relatively good job, you're educated, you've got your family, friends, you're well integrated. Do you feel you belong here? And I couldn't really answer. After 35 years, I just felt that maybe the best description is, I am a right-handed person who has learned to write with the left hand. The feeling is like that. I'm writing with my left hand, but does it come naturally? That feeling, I'm just trying to share my own feeling with you. And this was exactly what all the participants were telling me. I'm sure you all know about 5 stage of hierarchy of needs of Maslow. As you can see, it says that physiological, love, safety, and then we go. I mean, we have to really look into these 3 stages before we can get into mental health and support these people. So my model at New Citizens Gateway, our organization, formerly known as Barnet Refugee Service, we changed our name last year. So basically our model is, we have the client in the center, and then around it, we've got the basic needs, which is, food, shelter, emergency support, and then health access, things like that. And
Nazzy, Nazzy, sorry to interrupt. We're just about we're pretty much run out of time. If you don't mind just wrapping up.
I'll wrap it up. I'll wrap it up. Okay, sorry about that. I'll wrap it up. So basically this model is just, we're trying to bring a package together. So I show you in here, we have advice, tackling poverty, immigration, housing, and then we've got English classes, we've got moms and toddlers group, volunteering, mentoring, women's group, job club, homework club, befriending, and we have, on top of that, we've got like mother tongue counseling, individual and couples, group therapy, mindfulness, and we've got lots of psychosocial activities, gardening, things like that. So basically, and we've got youth activities again, counseling and all sorts of psychosocial activities. So basically, the bottom line is, I wanted to say that again, there is lots of impacts on the staff working with refugees. That area, I think, always gets ignored, if you like. So basically, we are trying to be mindful by having, screening policies and everything, to be aware of that. But apart from that, my main sort of overall, if I wrap it up, is refugees and asylum seekers, they do have a completely different needs. And based on our experience, we're providing a package which includes mental health, like one-to-one, but really more like psychosocial activities is more beneficiary. And also, I mean, like, these are the key factors of success with psychosocial activities. For me, as a CEO of the organization, I'm always looking for funding, because if we don't have funding, there is no work.
So yeah, thank you, Nazzy. I'm the Programme Director for the Doctorate in Counselling Psychology at the University of East London, and together with Professor Rachel Tribe, who was speaking earlier, the UEL Centre for Migration, Refugees and Belonging, we're looking into setting up a research group to help contribute to the evidence base of mental health and social support in emergency settings. And also on that campus, we have housed the Refugee Council archive for the last decade. The archivist, Paul Dedman, is also here today. The Refugee Council archive isn't it's not just a source of resources, it also asks how are refugees being represented, and in part that's what to kind of discuss, think about together today. So as a counselling psychologist, I draw from phenomenology as a kind of theoretical framework and a way of understanding human experience. And from this perspective, there are multiple ways of viewing the world, different truths that can coexist. Just as we have all had very different experiences of childhood, depending on how our carers and friends treated us, what born into, what economic resources we had access to, the education we received, the politics of the country we lived in, and so on. All of these environmental aspects influence our relationships and, most importantly, influence how we make sense of things. Psychologists are interested in the nature and development of humans, our thoughts and our emotions, which tells us that health and psychological well-being is not located in the individual, it is influenced by social determinants, education, nutrition, standards of living, work opportunities, and whether we're treated fairly. Yet in the West, UK, Europe, America, we generally draw from the model of psychopathology that largely locates distress within an individual. The theory of psychopathology attempts to delineate which human experiences are considered abnormal, illness, and which are not. The ICD and the DSM provide these kinds of definitions. Psychopathology that defines abnormalities and failure to function adequately based on statistical inferences and deviation from social norms. The definitions of mental disorders is critical to mental health professionals in psychiatry, psychology, and social work. They provide a common language with which to describe people's experience and associated interventions for how professionals might offer their support. One controversial issue is the distinction between dysfunctional or merely idiosyncratic behaviour. It's also noteworthy that this model of psychopathology only considers one side of this deviation. For example, major depressive disorder is a pathology. Unconstrained optimism is not a diagnosis. Diagnostic categories have also been criticised for their lack of evidence base. Dr. James Davies at Roehampton University, in his book Cracked, asked why, without solid scientific justification, the number of mental disorders has risen from 106 in 1952 to 374 today. And of course, there is the question of how deviant must a psychological phenomena be from the norm before it is considered abnormal or pathological. 1%, 5%, 49%, it's not a fact, it's open to debate. There are other criticisms to the theory of the medical model of psychopathology, but perhaps most importantly, it dichotomizes experience, normal, abnormal, sane, insane, healthy, unhealthy. And when theory transforms human experience into an illness to board, it implies that an expert is needed to cure it. So when the theory of psychopathology is used to understand people who have left their homes because of conflict or natural disaster, the implicit assumption is that extreme experiences such as war are not only distressing, but cause traumatization as defined by the DSM and the ICD, Western ideas. And as I mentioned, when we place the stress on a health illness, continue applies, the professional needs to intervene. The theory of psychopathology is the dominant model used by psychologists working with people who have since been given the refugee label. But the very definition of refugees, ratified by 145 of the world's states, is based on fear. The caveat of well-founded fear implies the individual does not only have to be defined by their fear, suggesting that this emotional response to a situation must be well-founded, but it also implies an evaluation of the legitimacy of this emotion. This, of course, by definition, is a highly subjective process. Firstly, if the parameters of what well-founded are not clear, it becomes up to the assessor to invent. Secondly, fear is an emotion that can be experienced by someone in their internal emotional world, but not seen by the observer. Notably, the way in which somebody might express fear might depend on their culture, gender, and of course, someone's capacity to speak English. Thirdly, why should somebody be afraid? Why not angry? Why not outraged? Why not indignant? Yet in this definition, the legitimacy and level of someone's is that that grants them refugee status. So by definition, we must be afraid if we are to have human rights. As we know, the UN currently estimates 84 million people are forcibly displaced. The refugee is often spoken of as I have just done: facts, figures, geography, and movement of people, legal definitions and photographic representations. The language used to construct the refugee phenomena is one of complex political disaster, crisis, national security, trauma, etc., essentially by somebody else's lens. The idea of the refugee is a product of an extraordinarily large and varied global phenomena. To conceptualize the refugee is impossible, that it involves no single identity position. One of the enduring consequences of being subsumed within a discourse of emergency is that the refugee phenomena is also exclusively interpreted as a problem in need of a solution. Peter Nyers argues that the concept of the refugee is constituted through a series of ontological omissions. Whatever is present to the citizen is absent to the refugee. The citizen is visible, has agency, is capable of rational speech, whereas the refugee is cast as invisible, speechless, and above all, non-political. When we speak of political sovereignty, then, we acknowledge a process of differentiation, of assigning characteristics, marking off limits, assigning positions, and assuming power relations. At global coordination level, the world leader in the provision of delivery of humanitarian aid is the UN. The Interagency Standing Committee is the primary coordination mechanism for international response to humanitarian emergencies. In 2007, they published guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings. Psychosocial support is defined as a psychological and social being, i.e. the interplay of the context and the individual. The IASC represents the highest level of coordination at international level within the humanitarian sector and are used by NGOs disseminating psychosocial interventions all over the world. Within these guidelines, mental health is defined in terms of a kind of psychic balance that is at stake in emergencies as being in need of protection and improvement, often but not always by trained persons or highly qualified experts. Psychopathology is used as a model to define experience. The problem of mental disorder is framed as needing the administration of resources and interventions. We know that in emergency settings, there are interplays of power and how psychosocial needs are assessed, including the ranking of vulnerability and the criteria used to make these decisions to the interventions delivered. This raises the question, who has the power to define the problem and whose knowledge is privileged? So just to finish then, by claiming to offer an intervention, whether that be curative, educational, correctional, that overrides someone's usual way of understanding and imposes another, implies a kind of overcoding of someone's experience. Albeit obvious, it's noteworthy that aside from psychopathology, as defined in the DSM and the ICD, there are other frameworks of understanding, other ways to interpret and understand experience. In some contexts, politics, culture, religion, spirituality, or tradition might form frameworks as to how experience is distressed and understood. Instead of treating these as at odds to Western psychological concepts, we might prioritize them. We need research into evidence-based psychosocial interventions. We need culturally appropriate research paradigms. Conceptualizations of human distress guidelines, especially in emergency contexts, then should not only adopt one particular kind of psychology, serving as both the benchmark from which phenomena is defined and the premise on which it did. Local practices and a person's understanding should not only be consulted, there should stand as at least equal ways of defining experience, which includes distress, and what is and what a helpful intervention might look like.
Thank you very much. Okay, now the previous two speakers in this session have given very broad talks about you know, the generality of mental health and refugees. I'm going to give a much narrower sort of worked example talk, but I think it works quite well in the context of what we've just heard, and also in the context of the inspiring poetry that we heard at the end of the previous session. So I'm Cornelius Katona. I'm a psychiatrist by trade. I'm medical director at the Helen Bamber Foundation, which provides holistic care for survivors of extreme human cruelty, such as torture and human trafficking. And the question that I want to put to you today is about whether we can develop accommodation centres for asylum seekers in a way that is trauma-informed and takes into account the needs and aspirations of the people who would be housed in those centres. If I can have the next slide. The reason that my colleagues and I, who were named on the first slide, did this piece of work was, or are doing this piece of work, because of our concern at the increased use of what the Home Office terms contingency accommodation in hotels, in disused barracks such as Napier Barracks, which has been quite a lot in the news lately, for what they conceive of as a sort of overspill, people for whom standard asylum accommodation, and we heard earlier about the enormous problems with such accommodation, but this is about the people for whom even that isn't available. And this is in the context of asylum claims in numbers having dropped in the last couple of years, but now increasing. And of course, there is a marked change, partly COVID related, in terms of routes and mode of arrival. And what we've all heard a lot about in the media is the notion of people coming by illegal means, in inverted commas, on small boats across the channel. There's also a huge backlog of undecided cases, and that means that people are staying in asylum accommodation longer, and that reduces the pool of that accommodation available to new arrivals. So there's a shortage of dispersed accommodation. And there is also an even more hostile environment in all but name, in that the Home Office wished to provide only basic accommodation. And this notion of accommodation centres with rapid, so it's imagined, processing of asylum claims, and that I think is part of the sort of commodification of the asylum process and of the people seeking asylum. That's integral to the Nationality and Borders Act, which came into law at the end of last month. If I can have the next slide. Now, things like contingency accommodation exist across the world, and probably the best known example are refugee camps. And we have reviewed the literature looking at the effects of refugee camp type accommodation on both physical and mental health, but concentrating for the sake of this argument on mental health. There are pretty consistent findings that particularly being for prolonged periods in this sort of accommodation is bad for mental health. What we've also been able to identify is that many of the studies identify particular aspects that lead to poor mental health. Isolation, a sense of being unwelcome, limited freedom, limited access to move, limited ability to cook, limited access to the food you want to cook, difficulty in accessing assistance, healthcare, legal protection, unsanitary and unsafe conditions, and we've heard about these earlier, and maybe above all else, restricted ability to work. If I can have the next slide. Our own experience in working with and assessing people in contingent accommodation is that we found the same as everybody else. Mental health was poor and tended to worsen the longer people were in such accommodation. All the people we assessed were significantly depressed, and the majority had symptoms suggesting that they had post-traumatic stress disorder. That's without getting into any discussion of the validity of the diagnosis. But again, we found that contributing factors to the distress were the prison-like conditions in the barracks, difficulty in sleeping associated with lack of space, lack of privacy, problems accessing medical care and, come to that, dental care, and uncertainty about how long they would be there. Self-harm was common, and that's been quite well publicized. And of course, in Napier Barracks, there was a huge outbreak of COVID at the beginning of 2021. And the fact that there was that outbreak made people there, whether or not they got COVID, feel very much more unsafe than they otherwise might. If I can have the next slide. So it follows, I think, from that, that there is a need for trauma-informed support and for that accommodation, if it's to work in the future, to be designed with that in mind. But the need for trauma-informed support is because of both high rates of past trauma and of significant mental illness, which may be severe, may be long-term, and apart from anything else, may interfere with the individual's ability to self-advocate and to participate effectively in the asylum process. For people, and we work a lot with people who've survived human trafficking, there's a lot of bad practice around counter-trafficking, around supporting victims of trafficking, but there are some good things in the national referral mechanism, the national framework for dealing with people who claim to have been trafficked. If they're claimed, if their reasonable grounds are identified for their claim, they're provided with safe house accommodation, they're provided with a right to a period of recovery and reflection with a view to a further recovery needs assessment at the point that it is decided that yes, they definitely are victims of trafficking. There is a trauma-informed code of conduct, which in fact we developed at the Helen Bamber Foundation, which has been incorporated into the statutory guidelines for the Modern Slavery Act. And there is a framework for support workers to create a person-centered recovery plan. Now, might something like that be workable for asylum seekers? Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. So if we were going to provide something like that for asylum seekers, we feel that they would need to be and to feel that they are welcomed, that they're safe, that they're included into their local environment and society, that any such accommodation should be pre-planned to anticipate their likely health and social care needs, and that would need to be in consultation both with the local community and with them or their predecessors, people who know through their lived experience what might be needed in such accommodation. They would need support in accessing services. The staff working with them would need to work in and be trained in trauma-informed working. There would need, and other speakers have said similar things, there would need to be a focus on recovery, if you like, on resilience, rather than simply on basic survival needs. Problems should be identified and dealt with early. There should be wraparound support to prioritize recovery, and there should be good connection, good communication between services. The dots need to be joined up. Next and last slide, please. And the other main notion is that any such accommodation should be planned in order to avoid human rights abuses. There should be the development and appropriate monitoring of minimum standards to prevent such abuses. For example, abuses of power by staff, avoidance, identification of bullying, assault, and exploitation of the most vulnerable residents by other residents. There should be proper provision of healthcare which anticipates likely needs, and public health risks, of which COVID would be an obvious example, should be addressed in advance. There are related standards in existence, for example, the minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the UK Bangkok rules, which address the needs of female offenders, and there are quality standards developed by the Faculty of Forensic and Legal Medicine, and I was involved in developing these standards. They were published in 2019, and they are for healthcare professionals working with victims of torture in detention. Now, none of these standards are ideal for this purpose. The point is that they show it's possible. And the contrast that I want to leave you with is the contrast between, on the one hand, the notion that accommodation centres may be positive places in which people may begin their asylum journey, and the disasters such as Napier Barracks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cornelius. And we've just got a little bit of time left for questions, which Hannah will convene.
Thank you very much to all the presenters. Such important topics and complexities. So there are quite a few questions. I'll pose one to each, but I would like to ask you to sort of stay on point with your answers to give a chance for everyone to get a question. So the first one is to Nazi, and it pertains to language. Someone asking, Nazi, please could you explore further why language is so important in the psychotherapy, sorry, I start again. Nazi, please could you explore further why language is so important in the psychotherapy encounter? People getting therapy through being able to speak their first language.
Sure, I'll make it very short, make sure. It's just, I mean, if I talk about my own experience, I don't know, with language, no matter how much you master the language, the feeling, you know, for example, the words that I use in English, and I use it in, you know, in my own language, that sits better with me. And when I say I am sad in English, it's completely feeling that the process I go through is slightly different when I say it in my own language. So this is how it is. I mean, like, language is something that you're born with and you're very comfortable. There was a research about this, that even swearing in a foreign language is easier for us than in our own language. So that again, it shows that, you know, how comfortable we are with our own. So expressing feelings in your own language is much, much easier than in a second language that you know. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The next question is for Claire, and I hope I'm getting the question right. So Claire, given the complexity of mental health interventions in conflict settings and to refugees, how could the institutional terrain look like to accommodate phenomenological and culture-based interventions?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of, I mean, it's not necessarily that we have to kind of do away with this model of psychopathology. It's just to kind of hold it in mind as just one way of understanding experience. So if that could be reflected in kind of policy and guidelines, so that it's not the dominant model, it's not the kind of go-to, and that there is much more kind of research around local practices, cultural understandings of distress, you know, not thinking about kind of how political voices might feature, and thinking about human experience. It's to adopt a much more holistic approach rather than kind of this narrow health illness continuum that we tend to, I mean, we even talk about trauma as if it's a given. It's not, it's, you know, it's a paradigm.
Thank you very much. And last question to Cornelius. Someone writing, Cornelius, other much poorer countries have been using trauma-informed holistic care for refugees, building resilience for years, and employ refugees. How can we gain support and funding for this in the UK?
Well, I mean, I think that's a very political question. And I think the mystery is why we don't do it already. I mean, I think that apart from anything else, a very good economic case can be made for enabling people to work early, because all the studies that I know of, at any rate, show that allowing asylum seekers to work is good for the economy, quite apart from the good to the asylum seekers. So we could be very selfish and self-interested and still promote this, and it would save in asylum administration costs, it would save in benefits, it would save in healthcare costs, but it would also save in economic productivity, because we would add to a workforce that needs adding to, as the effects of Brexit have shown. But that was a political statement as well. I think that a lot of this is about public perceptions and about, I mean, I would hope that this government, having overshot in terms of its ambition to be hostile, and the recent events in Ukraine, and to a lesser, sadly, extent, the recent events in Afghanistan, I think they have had quite a marked effect in changing public perception towards refugees as being a group of people who are deserving of help. Now, the trouble is that refugees aren't simply deserving of help. They're deserving of integration, of inclusion, of not being seen as victims needing help, but as people who make a contribution and are to be welcomed. And I think that the sort of refugees, you are welcome here approach in Germany in 2015 is something that should inspire the rest of us, or make us all feel ashamed, whichever we choose.